All right. Thank you so much. And you guys sound like you have a good lineup going up too, coming up. I am Shelby Justl. I was here a while ago talking about Egyptian beekeeping and honey, if you remember that from a bit longer than I care to remember. It feels like yesterday. So I am going to share with you the most interesting parts of my dissertation research, a long, hard battle of learning these things about the Egyptian semi-precious stone industry. And I ended up learning a lot. So I'm going to talk to you about my motivations for this, what got me going, and then what I discovered from mining to crafting to distribution of semi-precious stones in ancient Egypt. And overall, my research basically shows that these are very valuable minerals, but they're carefully guarded and controlled by the Pharaoh, which is an assumption I had going in, but I didn't know quite the level of it. My interest in this topic actually came from a cool discovery from the University of Pennsylvania's archaeological dig in South Abydos in Wasut. This is an ancient town site called Wasut that we dig in, and Abydos is basically right here in Egypt, right before the Gaina Bend, and then this is the site reconstructed based on the archaeological remains of part of the mayor's house that we were working on one of the seasons I was there. And that's my background as well, is from our dig site at Abydos. I decided to feel a little warmer than I do right now. So that's my colleague and myself, and we are just showing you how the site looks like today. And what was really cool is this ostracon came out of the ground, a piece of stone with ancient Egyptian hieratic in one of the digs of the University of Pennsylvania of 2001. And they basically put it away for later studies, as we find so many cool things that we don't usually have time to. And I was able to look at it in 2015 and many years later, and I got really interested in what it was saying. It comes from the 18th dynasty town of Wasut. It used to serve the burial site of Senwosret III. The tomb is right there. But then it was also active in the New Kingdom. That was in the Middle Kingdom, and it was also active in the New Kingdom with nearby mortuary temples of Moza and other things like that. And they found this ostracon right in one of the ancient streets of Abydos, of Wasut. You have the town, the mayor's house complex right to your left, and then it was in this crossroads of a street. It's really cool because I took a look at it and translated it, and it is an inventory listing lumps of unprocessed semi-precious stones and gold coming to the site and to the New Kingdom temple town. And this is what it looks like in real life. This is our image, and I showed you the materials on the side that it includes. It includes gold, lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan in ancient times, and then red jasper, which is a really popular stone too in ancient Egypt. And here is the translation I was able to do. So it is 125 pieces of lapis lazuli, a record of that which someone counted, and then it kind of trails off. And then it says 121 pieces of gold, 21 pieces of red jasper, 8 bits of red jasper, 4 bits of lapis lazuli, and something else about lapis lazuli, and then it trails off. And it posed a lot of questions to me. These stones cannot be found locally at Abydos, and neither is there a gold mine at Abydos. So the stones especially were interesting because red jasper, as far as we know, comes from the eastern desert of Egypt, so far away from our central Abydos. And then it also, Afghanistan is where you get the lapis lazuli as well, so it's even outside of Egypt. And we don't find a whole lot at the site. Recently, we found at that same town site during our excavations in 2013, I was able to find this piece of red jasper in that town site. So a raw piece that was going to be worked into something, hopefully. And then in some nearby graves that are dating to the New Kingdom, we also see some jasper. This is made of red and green jasper, and it's a heart amulet that was buried with the deceased. So we see a few beads here and there, but this showed a significant amount of semi-precious stones in their raw state. They're unfinished, just the raw stones to be crafted in the area by local jewelry crafters or local workshops. So I wanted to know a lot about this. Where did they come from? Who's sending them? And why? So I decided to do some work on the overall operation of the semi-precious stone industry. And I figured out that it was an industry that's strongly controlled by the Pharaoh, and controlling the stones is actually an aspect of kingship that we don't always talk about. And I wanted today to discuss the operation of it, royal control from mining, storage to distribution. We'll talk about texts and titles from mining sites that show the king's control. Also show you some actual temple treasuries that would have held the stones, including images, but also an actual temple treasury that ended up having stones inside to prove that. And even how the king controls distribution after mining in taxes, distributing to the temples, and workshops across Egypt. And so at the end of today, you're going to see how highly valued these stones are, and closely safeguarded by the Pharaoh and the Egyptian state. But before I get started, I wanted to clarify what stones I'm talking about when I say semi-precious stones. Some of you are probably more familiar than others if you've been working in your experimental archaeology group, but those available to Egypt are amethyst, carnelian, jasper includes a red variety, a yellow variety, and a green, lapis, which comes from outside Egypt, turquoise, amazonite, agate, garnet, hematite. And semi-precious stones were used by the Egyptians in all periods of time, but some were more popular than others due to access to certain mines or certain sources. But as early as the late pre-dynastic period, before we even have the Egyptian state, they had access to these stones and were burying themselves with them. So the first dynasty tomb of King Jer at Abydos has a lot of lapis and other items in there, turquoise, amethyst even. And so it's impressive to see that it's early on important to Egypt. And museums worldwide have these stones in their collections. A couple are from Penn Museum's own collection. Actually, all of these are. So I've got some carnelian beads on your left. In the middle, I have a turquoise amulet, and then some amethyst beads on the right. Today, we call these stones semi-precious, which kind of leaves that classification of precious stone for sapphires, diamonds, emeralds, and rubies. But for the ancient Egyptians, they didn't know any of those stones. So what we call semi-precious stones were their most valuable stones. And they classified them, the rare, shiny, brightly colored gems, as a'at, which I've given you the word on the bottom of your screen. And that refers to semi-precious stones, but it also comes from the word meaning great or rich. So semi-precious stones were considered great or rich, valuable, and that likely comes from the difficulty of acquiring them from faraway mines. But they appreciated the beauty of them, but also they believed they had symbolic power or active power in the semi-precious stones. So they carefully selected gemstones for certain amulets, jewelry manufacture, believing that they have symbolic magical traits. And here's some examples of these. We find that these amulets must be in a certain material in texts like the Book of the Dead or coffin texts that end up saying this amulet is made of this material. You put it over the throat of the deceased and say this certain spell, and it will do this. So just a couple of these. Carnelian is used in a lot of amulets, and it manifests protection, fury, anger, and violence. One coffin text, 83, says an carnelian amulet in the shape of a lion protects against, in the land of the dead, against the god Shu, who can interfere in your afterlife. And then red jasper is the required material for this teat amulet, which is associated with Isis. And the Book of the Dead says that it must be made of this material, red jasper, and sprinkled with water of the white lotus plant, placed on the transfigured spirit at his neck to, again, protect the deceased. Amethyst has protective qualities as well. There's one coffin text, 576, that says it allows a man to copulate in the afterlife if you put this carnelian or amethyst bead, usually amethyst, and it's placed for the auk at its right arm. So it enables you to do all the activities you were doing in your life today. And then green jasper, also popular. There are green jasper heart amulets, like I showed you in the one from Abydos, and they protect you in the afterlife as well, giving power to your soul, home of your spirit, and the heart scarab protects your heart in particular. And this is one where it has that spell associated with the heart. It's a specific Book of the Dead chapter 29b. And it'll protect your heart against anything. If your heart goes missing in the afterlife, it can stand in the place of that. And so they all have certain different functions. And I think this is partly why semi-precious stones were so valuable for the ancient Egyptians. They also considered the stones to make up the body of the gods. So their skin is gold, their bones are silver, and their hair is made of lapis lazuli, the blue stone, and their blood is carnelian or red jasper. And we see a lot of that. And they even compose aspects of statues of Osiris as far as it's recorded in some of these texts. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about that briefly is just to show you that the mining was likely motivated by the value of the stones and the symbolic powers. But semi-precious stone mining was difficult. It is something where the stones are found in Egypt's periphery. You have the Eastern Desert, you have the South, the Nubia, you have the Sinai, so far away from the centers of Egypt, either near Cairo, where you have Memphis as the capital for many times. Sometimes the capital becomes Thebes, and far south, it's still a difficult task. And it would be hard to go there with long expeditions, a lot of supplies, and then return with mined materials. So you need a lot of people on your side, all of that. An added complication is how difficult it is to extract these stones. They required really substantial knowledge of these materials and how to extract it. And so these expeditions were some of the most difficult. And that leads into our discussion of who's running them. So I'm going to talk to you about that, but I wanted to show you up in the Sinai in the north, that's where we find our turquoise mines. And then in the Eastern Desert, sort of by Kamambo, between that and the Red Sea, we see Amazonite mines. And then in the south, in what could be Nubia during certain periods, is Wadi el-Hudi for amethyst, and then a carnelian possible site for many periods is Jebel el-Asr, which is even further south. So I wanted to look into this, and here's some of the cool things I found. So several inscriptions from Wadi el-Hudi, which is the amethyst mine, and the Sinai, the turquoise mine, specify that the king's the one to order and send expeditions from within the capital, actually. So this first text says, the king places this man at the head of the expedition, ensuring that he will bring back what his majesty requests, basically. That's that first text. And then the other one says that the king is actually ordering these mining operations while seated on his palace throne, which at this time, I think, is in Thebes West. This is Amenhotep III. And it says his majesty was in the southern city, in the palace on the west side, which refers to Thebes West. So far south. when the royal scribe and head of the treasury, Hotep called Pa-Nessi, was commanded to bring turquoise. Okay, so he is sitting happily on his throne in the south, in Thebes. And then he's telling people to go all the way up to the Sinai, which today is 10 hours drive from right about there, or a 13-hour drive, I think, from there to Cairo today. And then to get to the Sinai, I always would go there when I studied abroad in Egypt on a bus that was an overnight bus to even get to the Sinai, to some of those areas. So that's how far it takes us today. And so you would have had to have a lot of organization. And the king is the one that wants this, and he's picking officials from right by his side that he trusts and can put in control of these operations. Also, I figured out from looking at all these stelae from these excavation sites, these mine sites, I learned that the people that are the ones that look for the gemstones, they're specially trained. They're called mes'a'at, roughly translated to gemstone, extractor, prospector. And it refers to skilled workers who can identify the best veins to find the best quality of stone, particularly for gemstones. Wadi al-Hudi has a text, so that amethyst mine says that 41 overseers of the mesu'a'at, so overseers of these gemstone extractors, come from the residence, so from the capital. So it's showing that this is not an easy task. It's something that would have been trained in the capital. And likely the government could have a good control over watching this happen, making sure it's done with their interests at heart. Also, I found out that the king has a quota, a mining quota that he wants extracted per day for a particular mission. This is a man, an overseer of the expedition. I came to the mine of my master, meaning the Pharaoh. I ordered the work which I was going to do, and I assessed the turquoise deliveries at 25 hecat per 15 men daily of first quality. So really good quality, 25 hecat per 15 men. And this is happening, a text from the Middle Kingdom at the turquoise mine. A hecat is typically a measure of grain volume, and it usually equals about 4.8 liters of grain. You know, you put it in a sack, you measure it, and it's about that size. It's a measure of volume. So this text suggests that it's 120 liters, if we're using that measurement, of turquoise per day at this particular excavation. Now, since turquoise occurs in like irregular lumps when you're extracting it, it would be something like maybe they used leftover hecat sacks that the grain they brought with them was in, or baskets or something, to give you kind of a gross estimate of how much they collected. But this is something that if the hecat quota in Serabet al-Hadim text, the turquoise mine text, is a precise amount, it would actually equal 3,600 liters of turquoise collected in 2 months expedition. And this is what it says it is. And that is exceptional. And what I've showed you is this little travel-sized container we often use for our toiletries to carry on the plane. So if you're imagining this size, 7 by 5 by 2 inch, filled with turquoise, that is 3,600 of those. So that'll show you just how much this is, to give you an idea of it in something we might deal with more often than liters or grain measurements. This, combined with the inscriptions that say the king is selecting the expedition leaders from his own trusted officials, meaning he's picking them from the capital, and indicates that the king is directing these expeditions from quite far away. There's no real evidence that he actually ever visited the mining sites. There, people put up stelae in his name, but he stayed on the throne cushily, and he would have people do this and come back. And this is pretty impressive with that. Semi-precious stones also would come in. We say sometimes that the semi-precious stone leaders were also selected from the north or from the south, but it's impressive too that sometimes talking about the king that was ruling from Thebes in the south, that he was selecting special workers to send all the way to the Sinai because he trusted them most. So it shows it was important to the king, and he wanted to make sure he had kind of a hand in what was going on so he could trust those people. Now, another form of acquisition beyond mining is tribute. So semi-precious stones entered Egypt through Egyptian-led mining expeditions like those I just talked about, but they also come from tribute from foreign lands like Nubia in the south of Egypt. As expected, the king also plays a strong role in those that are tribute stones given from tribute operations. I looked at one New Kingdom administrative center in Upper Nubia, which is the south of Egypt, but it was an Egyptian-occupied town at that time, and it's called Amara West. And I found a lot of evidence of semi-precious stones across the site, but also that locally mined stones, because some of them come from this area, were gathered and collected in special warehouses. And they were actually by Egyptian appointed officials and prepared them for importation into Egypt. And operations in this particular site is further evidence that acquisition and storage operated under a strong centralized control. So this kind of serves as a little case study to examine other forms of acquisition like tribute and from foreign places. So I'm going to show you where and what Amara is for Egypt, and as well as the role of the deputy of Cush. He's an Egyptian appointed official who oversaw all activities in this town on behalf of Egypt. And then I'm going to show you where those stones are found within the site because they have a good archaeological record. So by looking at this site, I was able to determine a lot because the semi-precious stones are found in certain areas. So there are 78 semi-precious stone objects that I was able to look at in the British Museum where they have most of these items now. They come from the Amara West 1938, 1947 through 50 excavations. And of them, I found 49 carnelian objects, 26 red jasper objects, a quartz pendant, a yellow jasper bead, and one amethyst bead. And we know all of these are coming from broadly this New Kingdom time, Seti I and Ramses II, because they even have levels that were recorded, which is great for archaeologists. But what was most interesting to me is of the 67 items that had recorded find spots, exact locations, I found that 48 clustered in 3 areas of this town. And they were associated either with a temple or the residence of the deputy of Cush, his palace that he ruled out of and governed the area on behalf of Egypt. 18 items were in temple storerooms. 16 were in the actual palace, the residence of the deputy of Cush, and 14 were in storerooms directly connected to that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, indicating that there's closely supervised management by the deputy of Cush on behalf of Egypt to collect these and return them to Egypt. All right, so Amara West, the temple, is on this right-hand side. We have a temple right here, and then the storerooms that I found these objects to be in are right behind the temple, as close as they could be really in this structure is one of the ones that I found. And a little bit about that, this interesting structure is directly south of the temple. It is something that is rooms 4 and 6 in particular appear to have were storage magazines of finished stoned objects and certain crafting supplies. So you have 4 right here and 6 right here and 5 as well that are important. The structure is entered from room 1, and then we find a few carnelian objects here and there. One is in room 2, which is the center area, and we have a couple others, like a penannular jasper earring in one, and then room 5 seems to be this kind of main room of this structure. And a bunch of them branch off. You have this room, this room, this room, this room, all branching off of it. And the vaulted ceilings date it to the Ramesside period, so Seti the First or Ramses the Second, but we're thinking mostly Ramses the Second. The reports say that in 5A, there were strands of red jasper beads that we find, carnelian beads, an earring, and other small items. These have since actually been lost because that was in the archaeological report. They aren't in the British Museum. But the objects found in 4 and 6, these eastern rooms, show that they're storerooms for craft production supplies. So the floor of 6 has red and yellow ochre lumps and blocks to grind them on, sandstone blocks and a grindstone and other things. And the excavators think that this was used to mix paint, this room. And then there are also 2 other items that come from this room. I've showed you right here. One is a red jasper hoop earring, and the other is a piece of carnelian, an amulet, that is actually broken. They tried to drill the hole through it, and they drilled it too far to one side, so it breaks. And this is something which shows a mistake, a discarding of item, because now you can't use that. It's no longer useful for jewelry. And that kind of suggests that it could have been a workshop area, or at least a storage of supplies that are crafting supplies. We don't see any other drill bits or anything in this room that would further prove that, but it's interesting to see that together with other stone workbenches is what they call these, this room. And then also there's a sunken pot in 5A, which had gold-bearing quartz. So they were extracting gold from that. So a lot of interesting materials suggest that this is either storing important materials for crafts, or that it was maybe a workshop area to store these as well. So some work could happen in here, some work happens outside in the open air. And the palace itself has a lot of items. I have given you a map that shows you carnelian items, which are in orange, and red is red jasper items, and where they're found in this. So the deputy of Kush's residence is all of this up here. And of it, I found 16 items in there. And the storage magazines on this bottom to the west have 14 objects. And excavations of this residence were somewhat rushed. So the palace, the findings are a little less clear. Some levels were messed up a little bit, and a little difficulty understanding exactly what room, because some were misrecorded. But the storage magazines to the west on the bottom are more revealing about what's going on with this industry. This building right here, over here, seems to be a storage building, and so does this structure, and they actually share a wall. This wall right here is the outer wall of the palace, and the storerooms share this wall with the palace. And so here are the storage magazines right here to zoom in on what they are. The blue magazines were what I was just talking about, and this yellow one is interesting as well. The blue rooms originally had a doorway going to the west wall of this palace, so they would have entered right about here. And then also this one had 2 entrances into the palace. One appears to be on a lower level, and one appears to have been blocked, and that appears to have been blocked up in later times. And another one you see right here has a little staircase. That's the image for a staircase. It led to an upper floor of the palace. So basically, this deputy of Kush could go directly into the magazines that had the most semi-precious stones in all of this site, and he could access this directly, which is very interesting. The structure in yellow had 12 carnelian objects, and I've showed you where they are. They include earrings, poppy seed pod amulets, which are these the curvy round things. They also have beads, even earring cores. So you have those hoop earrings, but then the cores they had to drill out, and lots of other things. So this was interesting to find. You also find other related things like bronze and copper items and bone items, but more valuable things, it seems. And we see some that are completed objects and some that are incomplete, like this earring core and workshop residue or remains, and then this piece of chunk or piece of unworked material or chipped off of other material. These two items were particularly interesting, the earring core and the piece of unworked material, because the one just indicates workshop activity. They were making some of these items at that site. But the other, the piece of stone right here, this raw chunk of carnelian, it could be an unprocessed stone waiting to be carved, or even a rough preform for a bead. So it's very hard to carve these things, and as you may already know, and they are often at one site. This is from Hierakonpolis. Early on, we find a carnelian workshop, and they have a bunch of carnelian pieces. They have the finished product in Hierakonpolis, but we also have blocks that look like preforms for beads. They are usually there 1.5 by 1.5 by 1.5 centimeters. This example is happening in the New Kingdom, but it's 1.33 by 0.97 by 1.18, which is a similar size as those preforms for beads here in Hierakonpolis. So these completed objects, as well as kind of incomplete objects, and their close connection with the palace, sharing that wall, suggests that he closely was able to safeguard these stones. What's interesting is the architecture is even similar. The connected magazine system we already know from Rekhmare's tomb. Now this is about the same time. This is the 18th dynasty, so a little earlier. We see this temple magazine structure, and this belongs to the temple treasury of Karnak. And this shows like how things are stored in certain storerooms. We have different labels for each storeroom. And one of Rekhmare's duties actually was collecting tribute from foreign areas and holding them in the treasury, the perhej. And that was Rekhmare's job as vizier, which is similar to how the deputy of Kush is also collecting tribute and storing it at his site in Nubia before it goes to Egypt. And these different labels just say a couple of different things about the items. They don't make a ton of sense as to distinguishing between groups. But you see some things that are very valuable right here. These are semi-precious stones at the top. We have gold rings and also other piles of gold, together with other luxurious things. And then over here, we have things from different districts. This is more from maybe the oases of Egypt. And we have some items that are tribute items, collecting things from other areas from Egypt, because we see ostrich feathers, which are a Nubian thing. So these treasury structures would hold these items after they would receive them. What's interesting is we see a similar structure archaeologically as we do in that image of the Temple of Amun treasury we see at the site Amara West in those rooms. So at the beginning, this marks the entrance to the treasury system in this scene. And then the other ones are vaulted storerooms after that. So presumably this is a gate leading into it. What's interesting is we also see a flat-topped gate in these storerooms and arched structures too. So this doorway, the flat-topped lintel, it belongs to that room, which has the most concentration of carnelian objects. And the other one goes for this other room. And what I'm thinking is the flat-topped lintel marks, in this scene, it marks the entrance to the treasury system. But here, it could mean the most important items. So whereas the other marks the significance, I think this also could say something because it's the only flat-topped entrance to one of these rooms. So I'm thinking it might say that this is a particularly significant storeroom. And the other one is also similar. The mud plaster leads in between these two rooms. And it's similar to the architecture of magazines we see at other temples, the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, and Ramesseum Temple. We also see things like that. And vaulted or arched roofs are typical of New Kingdom magazines, but this flat-topped one could indicate maybe something more significant. Either way, the matching architecture plus the findings that are in these areas kind of suggests that both are treasuries, both are storerooms holding important items, arguably tribute, and it's suggesting that the deputy of Kush is also collecting the tribute in the storerooms. And remember, this room had two entrances into the palace, into the residence of the deputy of Kush. So basically, you could come in and look at them at any time, make sure everything's there in between shipments back to Egypt. And in regards to the semi-precious stone industry as a whole, this case study kind of says it's tight centralized control. Even when the pharaoh isn't even present or nearby, there's still an official appointed by the king who is gathering tribute and sending it back to Egypt. In a similar manner that is done in Egypt. This is an Egyptian storeroom. In Nubia, they're operating the same way, making sure they're carefully controlled. So now I just want to talk to you a little bit about the next step. So after mining or tribute arrives in Egypt, the king will be the one to distribute the stones across Egypt to temple treasuries, workshops, their workshops in towns, etc. And I was able to look at a couple of texts that tell me a little bit more about this. So I wanted to see how much royal control is happening in this distribution. And it appears to be a royally dominated system, but it uses these centralized institutions of temples to control and then distribute some of the materials for them. So broadly, these are complicated terms, but Inu refers to redistribution where the king is the one giving the items. And he can be receiving them, but he also is often giving them. And the king's always an actor in this situation. So Papyrus Harris is something, it lists all the endowments that Ramses III gave to all temples across Egypt, and exact amounts of how much gold, oil, all sorts of things that he gave to these areas. And there's a heading called Inu of the King, or it's arguably the official gift is what it's called of the king. And this is something that occurs in every list that has any semi-precious stones. They are always labeled as Inu of the King, gift of the king, which is interesting because there's lots of other valuable materials in this thing that seem important but aren't under this heading. But whenever semi-precious stones or gold are mentioned, it's a gift of the king. So he is giving these raw materials, sometimes processed materials, sometimes scarabs or other jewels, and he is giving them to the temple himself, making sure it's clear he's the one doing it, and it's a gift from maybe his own storerooms themselves. And it may be that he's giving them from his own royal caches to temples across Egypt, but it expresses that these stones are particularly in the hands of the pharaoh. And there are other forms of temple income that are used in this, but semi-precious stones belong to this. So this also includes carnelian, lapis, red jasper, turquoise, amethyst, other quartz, amazonite, and other materials. There's another document right here. It's Papyrus Turin 1900, and it records, again, Inu that were red jasper that was given to this temple, and they are recording collecting it, a temple treasury collecting the Inu from another temple. So they are kind of recycling this red jasper. So what it is, they're collecting and recycling ritual materials that were used in statues of that area, and they are red jasper and they're labeled as Inus, and it says the collecting house is the northern treasury of the House of Amun, which refers to a Karnak temple treasury. But what's interesting is the objects are still called Inu, even after they're given. So they're still called a gift, which is of the king, basically, a gift of the king. But this is after the fact, they're still calling them that. But it shows that these stones can still be recycled, reused, sold, distributed by other parties after it goes into the temple's hands from the king. So now the temple has more activity. They're able to collect these and redistribute them themselves among their own treasury, workshops, etc. And then another one, Papyrus Bulaq 19, also dates to the Ramesside period. And it says red jasper bakut is going to the mortuary temple of Ramses II. And this is just another term. It usually refers to finished material products that are involved in temple transactions, complicated terms, but it says these terms are Baku and they're given to the mortuary temple of Ramses II. So it suggests that they're coming from another treasury, maybe a different temple treasury or state treasury, and they're going to mortuary temples and other temples across Egypt. But no doubt the king could give to his own mortuary temples, so it suggests some involvement there. And often it's something that the king would be involved with as well. We talked a little bit about storage and treasuries, which are official institutions of the palace or temples to store not only cult equipment for temples, but also these raw materials, tribute or taxes collected from foreign lands or Egyptian provinces. And by looking at the titles of some of these overseers and their duties, we can see how semi-precious stones were distributed, what these treasury officials are doing. So one of this just says the overseer of the double treasury, which is in Karnak, is providing jewelry craftsmen with necessary materials so that they can continue to produce jewelry from precious stones. And the next one is a 19th dynasty letter, which says about the royal palace decoration. And it says this guy, this official who's the overseer of the treasury, is leading craftsmen to do their work and giving them precious stones and electron without end. So he's responsible to distribute from that treasury to workshops, making sure they're produced and other people have access to them. The temple, but then they can be later sold too. This is the other letter I was talking about. It's saying I'm supplying the lapidary workers, so particularly the gemstone jewelers, and that are decorating the palace. And he's reporting back to the Pharaoh and other people that he's doing what he's supposed to. And I think there's some interesting information on how fast the king is distributing what he mines. I found an interesting connection between a word for a unit of mined turquoise in Ramses Papyrus Harris, which I just talked to you about, a visual representation of Ramses III giving mined turquoise to the god in his mortuary temple, and then also a little bit beyond that. So what I have is Papyrus Harris, like I said, would mention gifts to the temples, but it also described briefly an expedition to the Serbet al-Hadim, the mining of turquoise. And it says, marbles of real turquoise in countless purses have been brought to me. And that was in that text of Ramses III. And that's the word right there, ARF, and it defines as a bag or a purse. As you note, this determinative at the end, kind of a sack of turquoise is what it's discussing. What's interesting is in this scene, we see similar sacks right here of mined turquoise. One of them is turquoise. It lists it in here, and we also see other things, other stones right in here. We see right there. And what is interesting is I'm thinking on a site, they could use leftover sacks, like I talked about the grain sacks, and put things together and ship it back to Egypt that way in purses. Well, what this says in his scene in Medinet Habu, where he's giving all these sacks of materials to the god, that he's bringing it directly from the expedition in those sacks they likely used, and he's giving them to the temple magazine directly when he gets them. They haven't been transferred to another bag or anything. They're done just like this. So either his own storerooms or wherever he gets them, usually there's a scene where they present what they've mined, or if it's tribute, what they've sent, and he gives it directly. So this could indicate kind of how fast this is happening. And other things, so into workshops, we have weighing out of raw materials, scenes that show that they're carefully weighing out materials to give to craftsmen because they're so valuable. And this is a scene that shows that they were transferred to the treasury. Treasury officials likely just transferred them directly to these workshops. And weighing semi-precious stones and recording the weight would suggest that the craftsmen are receiving exact amounts of raw material and indicating they're valuable, and they might have daily allocation by a certain official, a treasury official from the temple or wherever, who might deliver the stones directly to them. And with certain amounts, everybody's taking a good record. What this is right here, this is the tomb of Ibi in Deir el-Brari, and it dates to the 6th dynasty. And it shows, the far right, they are weighing materials right here. It appears to weigh copper, actually, which is interesting because we have this sign right here that says copper. But it also, in the rest of the scene, is talking about drilling carnelian beads and polishing those beads. So presumably this, and since it's right after another, like a comic strip, they are related. So I think this represents the weighing of carnelian. We don't have a perfect text that says what they're doing. But then afterwards it says lapidaries, they're drilling carnelian, and then lapidaries, the jewelry makers, are polishing it. And so I think that's interesting because they're weighing the raw materials before they give them. And it appears to be a regular activity because we see weighing of some sort in 3 of the 7 scenes we have that survive that show bead manufacturing, semi-precious stone processing. So 3 out of the 7 suggest that it's an important thing. And this is the tomb of Nebamun and Ipuki from Amenhotep III, and it depicts this whole workshop scene. We've got a lot going on. We have workshop of amulets right here. They're just larger scale looking. We have other things where they're drilling beads right here. They are making statues, all sorts of things, and while the overseer watches. And this shows right here an early scene of a worker weighing some of the materials. Right here, he's weighing gold rings against a measurement, a certain solid weight that would have showed the amount it should be. This is a bull-headed weight. We see a lot of that. He's weighing gold rings for some of the other activities, but it's also presumably that he's weighing for the other items that are going on, because right here, we have some work that's going on related to the semi-precious stones. We have jewelry items above them, and then some hidden stones that are right here with a cloth over them. And then we also have drilling of beads right here, which could also be other types of beads too. But this clearly shows some semi-precious stones. So I'm thinking, well, that represents metal, this scene. It's also likely just indicating weighing of materials for all these workshops, which is interesting. And given the ordering of registers at the top like this, and then the rest of them continue on kind of on other planes. I'm thinking that this could symbolize what they're doing overall, the first step of workshop production of valuable materials, gold or semi-precious stones. And these scenes all kind of bring me back to where I started this lecture. So the ostracon from South Abydos that I showed you. It is a list of materials and quantities without indication of the sender, origin, destination, the actual recipient. And it's difficult to understand its exact function because it's just a list and it's not all complete either. So back to that ostracon, what I want to think about is what is its function? And I have several interpretations now that I've done all this research. I think it could be a packing invoice that was included with a shipment of gold, lapis lazuli, and red jasper to the temple workshop, a temple of treasury or workshops of South Abydos in the New Kingdom. It could have been sent from the capital or another region of Egypt by the king, either as that inu, that gift of the king where he redistributes it, or other things. It could be a receipt they wrote down, a local scribe wrote down upon delivery of these items. So he's making a record of it, just ensuring they have a good count before they start doing any work with them. Or it can be an inventory accounting for all raw materials at that time of gold, lapis, and red jasper that were present in the treasury, likely of the nearby temple treasury of Ahmosa, because that's very close to this site. It's just a couple steps away. So at the New Kingdom, they could have been workers there were wanting to take an inventory of what materials they have. Or it could be a written record of the exact amount of raw materials allocated to workshop craftsmen from the local treasury. So like the other scene shows that I just showed you, the weighing, it could be them recording it that day. So a lot of different ideas, but if it is, it's a written record. If it's the latter, it's a written record of the exact same activity I showed you in those tomb scenes. Visualizing, weighing, and allocating semi-precious stones from the treasury to the workmen. So a lot of different interpretations, but my research got me in a lot of different areas thinking about this and where these items were coming from and why. And mostly that the king is playing a strong role. I wanted to create a more strong picture of the administration and the control of this industry, who's operating in it. And I ultimately decided it's a strong royal role in control. And this also indicates it's an aspect of kingship and responsibility kingship that we don't always think about. He has to provide for his people. He provides in warfare. He does a lot of things, but controlling this industry and distributing it to all areas of Egypt is a duty of the king. And he used treasuries and treasury workshops and treasury officials, along with other appointed officials like the deputy of Cush, to facilitate distribution, storage, and production within the semi-precious stone industry. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, the main findings of my dissertation, which was very interesting to learn how things operate, and just a couple of thank yous that got me through my dissertation, all of those lovely, lovely people that helped me out. All right, well, thank you.